Okay, first of all, thank you very much, Nina, for taking out time on a special request. Tomorrow is a big day. Today, over here where I am, and tomorrow where you are, President Trump is to meet President Putin. And this is going to be a group meeting. It's going to be called like a 6-on-6 team. And then there's going to be this a press conference. All this is happening in Anchorage, Alaska. Give us your opinion about this meeting. What is the significance? What should people be looking out for? What is on the table for bargain?
So I think the question when Alaska, and not just Alaska, but the United States was that location was first announced, everyone from every camp was surprised because we know that one of the international criminal courts has a warrant out for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, and some people were saying, isn't he going to get arrested if he goes to the United States? Now, two things. First, the United States does not recognize the jurisdiction of this court. Now, personally, if I were in this position, I would not be traveling because you just never know what could happen, even if there is no recognition of this court. But apparently decisions were made. We don't know what was said behind the scenes to make this an attractive location and date for both parties. But the other thing specifically about this warrant, it was a political decision. So when people hear that there is this international criminal warrant out for Putin, they think it's something about, massacring civilians or something awful like that. It's actually about allegedly kidnapping children. Now, Putin and one of the government officials who is also has a warrant out for her arrest didn't actually kidnap children, believe it or not. I mean, it sounds kind of outrageous. They basically evacuated children from war zones, which is what you're supposed to do, right? You evacuate civilians. Since then, some of those have been reunited with their families, and others that were really publicized in the Western media, they are simply debunked. The children were not even in Russia. So the overall premise for this warrant is very different from some of the other ones that have been used by this court. And I know it's not the only international criminal court. So I think that's also really important to mention. But nonetheless, technically, the US doesn't recognize its jurisdiction. So I'm assuming that is the thinking there regarding actually traveling to the United States instead of, let's say, neutral platform like Turkey or another country that has been used in the past for, not just the ceasefire negotiations, but for prisoner exchanges and so on and so forth. So we know that from the Russian perspective, the Kremlin always issues official statements coming from not just the Kremlin spokesperson, but other highly positioned individuals who are basically invested with the power to share such official decisions. The Kremlin says it's open to negotiations. It also wants to share its position directly with President Trump. In their view, from the statements that I saw, they believe that other parties are sort of getting in between and influencing Trump's opinions. And there's also this propaganda war, obviously, that, is pretty typical of wartime. And so according to the Kremlin, there's a lot of disinformation regarding their intentions and what they're bringing to the table. And so they want to have that direct contact. So I suppose the idea that they will have that direct contact. And remember, it's not just Putin, it's also the foreign minister Lavrov, who is a very, very skilled diplomat. I mean, he's been a diplomat for decades. He's probably one of the most respected diplomats in the world. You can always watch little clips of him where there's like a lineup of people trying to meet with him and shake his hands at any international meeting he goes to, despite the supposed Russian isolation. So those two are, those two are probably the most highly positioned individuals to travel from Russia to this particular summit. So it seems that having that direct face-to-face contact is important to them so that there's no third party that can influence what is being said by Putin. And it seems like it's difficult to say, but it seems like the way this meeting was set up also might have had some third-party involvement, where what Putin might have said might have been twisted a little bit when it was given to Trump. So what what Putin might deliver in person might be a little bit different from what President Trump is expecting. And so I think it's really important to think about the Western side as, I guess the easiest way to perceive it is two different factions, right? There's sort of a realist faction that sees this war as essentially being over because Russia has had many successes in the battlefield, especially recently. And there's also the war party that basically, as the saying unfortunately goes now, wants to fight to the last Ukrainian. And so the war party these days is represented by the EU, and specifically Germany, France, the Baltic countries, certain officials like, Ursula von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, et cetera, also the UK, which is not in the EU, but some would claim that it's probably the most aggressive party behind this war, even more so than the US. I mean, I've heard this argument, and because we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes, we can assume that may be the case based on certain things that we have seen. So, for instance, Boris Johnson allegedly undermining the initial Istanbul negotiations in 2022, and so on and so forth. And then the Realist Party obviously wants this war to come to an end. And within the US and North America in general, the two factions exist, right? So you might remember that Trump's mandate when he was elected was saying that he'll end the war in a single day, which is obviously very, very populist, I suppose, but that's not what happened. And so you can kind of see that and it's not even party specific in the US. There are certain individuals in both major parties that support this war. We know who they are, and there are others. And those are just the public people. We don't know what's going on behind the scenes. We don't know what he's being told behind the scenes as well. So this is the Russian perspective. So basically sort of debunking some of the disinformation that Russia believes is around not just the war in Ukraine in general, but specifically these negotiations, but also having that direct communication with the President of the United States. The other thing to note here is that there's been this statement going around that every new proposal that Russia makes is going to be worse than the earlier proposal, and that's been true. If you think about the initial 2022 Istanbul meeting that was allegedly undermined by Boris Johnson of the UK, Russia was really making huge concessions, and that agreement, in my opinion, would have been very detrimental to Russia. Nonetheless, they were going to agree to the conditions that were set at this time. But every time Russia makes basically progresses in the battlefield, and the Ukrainian front in some ways seems to be collapsing. And remember, it's not like this gradual thing. And I'm not a military expert, obviously, but there's going to be this extreme collapse. It's not going to be this. It might be like a plateau, and then it's going to be very sudden, because this is what happens in war. If you look at other wars, this is what happened there too. And so right now, the Russian position in the battlefield is very strong. So even the skeptics are forced to admit this. And
I'm sorry to cut you off. This makes me think, who initiated these talks? Who initiated the meeting? Do we have something on that?
Well, I've seen both things. I've seen the Western media report that it was, of course, the Russian side that wanted to meet with President Trump, and I've seen the opposite being said. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the confirmation. The Russian side said it was actually the other way around. So one of them did. But I think it's actually a really good question to ask, because if you think about it, so we go from Trump promising that he'll end the war in Ukraine in a single day, right? Then things escalate, and he issues an ultimatum that Russia has to make some very serious decisions in 50 days. Then he changes that ultimatum and makes it even more extreme, and he says 10 to 12 days. And all of a sudden, something happens there. Something is being said behind the scenes. We only have the official report. We don't know what is being said, that they decide to meet. So obviously, something must have been very appealing to both sides to come to the decision to meet in Alaska. And the other thing I think that's important to note, because everyone is focusing on the war in Ukraine, but there are other reasons for the US and Russia to meet in terms of economic cooperation. I've seen all kinds of theories being floated around that Trump is going to offer Russia some kind of access to either the energy that's available in Alaska for mining or rare earth minerals or whatever. Who knows? But even if that's not true, there are reasons for Russia and the US to cooperate economically. And that might be something that will be discussed. And of course, Trump, having his business background, might be very interested. He doesn't just like making deals, whether they're successful or not is another question, but he also likes to be very showy about them, right? So he might be thrown a few bones in this regard in terms of having that economic cooperation that makes them look really good for those who elected him, right? And so go ahead.
Yeah, I also saw some news pieces on people talking about Trump being ready to give off some of the territory of Ukraine to Russia even before the talks started. Have you heard that?
I saw probably the same pieces. Obviously, that's not what's coming from Zelensky and from the European Union. Again, they sort of want to progress in the war and continue it at any cost. And the cost is, for the EU, it's financial, of course, and it's detrimental to them. But for Ukraine, it's the human cost, which is already through the roof. And in that sense, remember, Zelensky was not reelected, right? There were no elections. And some people have said, well, it's the wartime. You're not supposed to have elections in wartime. But there are many examples where countries did hold elections in the US in World War II, right? Roosevelt was reelected. I mean, Russia is at war too. Putin was reelected. I mean, there are many examples where elections are held. So Zelensky, technically is now the dictator of Ukraine. And so, I mean, it's not just a statement that he's not letting people leave. He is he's lowering the mobilization age. He is hunting people down to drag them to the army. There are, countless videos now, but it's also in terms of the status of his being president. I mean, that expired in May of this year. So that's also another thing to note. But yeah, obviously, that front, the war party, let's call them that, is pretty united, that they're going to make no concessions. And I believe when they say no concessions, they're not just talking about Donetsk, Lugansk, and the other regions that Russia has reclaimed, or as the other side would say, has conquered. But they're also talking about Crimea. Now, Crimea has been annexed, over a decade ago. There's been multiple referenda, even before 2014, where the majority Russian Russophone population voted to either be autonomous or to be with Russia. And of course, in 2014, they decided to join Russia. And so that's not even something that would be considered, to today, basically. And so I don't know whether that's actually going to be said, but the reality on the ground is that Russia controls, I believe it liberated in the Russian perspective or conquered in the Western perspective, all of Lugansk, most of Donetsk. And the reason it's taken so long is because the West armed Ukraine and trained Ukraine and dug those World War I, World War II style trenches for a decade, right? Almost a decade. And that's why it's been so difficult to move into that area. And they're going literally like village by village. And it's taking a lot of manpower to basically claim this land and to move forward. But Russia also controls parts of two other regions, and it looks like it's proceeding. And so it's what I said, the better Russia performs on the battlefield, the better is its negotiating position and the stronger it feels. And so it would be very difficult for me to imagine that they're going to just agree to giving up any of the land that has been claimed by them. I don't know what Trump will do. I mean, if he is a realist, or if he's being informed by realists, he will understand that there is a reason why the Russian position is what it is. It's been claimed through blood. So I can't really say anything more beyond that, because there's been so much flip-flopping
Yeah,
coming
yeah.
from from
If
that side.
if we imagine both of these guys sitting together on the table, who do you think would be running the conversation? Just your opinion.
Well, they have very different personalities. Again, Trump is a showman, right? He really feeds off of that energy. And Putin is, he's a former intelligence officer. He is very patient. He's very calm. He has had many, many hostile interviews with the Western media where the journalists asked him some very tough questions, and he wasn't triggered in a way that others would have been triggered. He's really rational. He's almost too legalistic. And so they have very different approaches. I think that Putin is obviously a much more experienced statesman than Trump. Trump is a more experienced businessman, right? So it really depends on what they're discussing. Putin is, I believe he probably understands how to deal with a personality type that Trump is, and how to give them the type of attention that he seems to enjoy. And by doing so, perhaps throw a few proverbial bones. By doing so, he would perhaps get Trump to maybe see the Russian side a little bit clearer, or to make certain concessions. It's very hard to say, but their personalities are definitely very different. But I think Putin is maybe a little bit better at understanding the other and actually caring about the person across the table and how to approach them. And of course, Lavrov is a diplomat. I mean, that's his job to do that. Whereas Trump kind of seems to just want to drive down his point, and to, if you're not agreeing with him, he'll just talk you down and maybe even embarrass you.
Nina, last thing, I'm so sorry to take your time. These guys have met before. This is not the first time it's happening. Where was those circumstances?
Well, I think this is one of the reasons there was this whole Trump-Russia thing, right? That has been since debunked, right? That Trump is somehow being funded or controlled by the Kremlin. Trump would make, even before 2016, right, before the initial elections, a lot of positive comments about Putin. And I think that's because he is a little bit more maybe socially conservative, and he perceives Putin comes across as the strong man, right? So he perceives other leaders like that in an amicable light, as opposed to perhaps certain European leaders that he would perceive as weak. And so I think he's naturally attracted to that idea of, okay, I'm a strong man, and here's another strong man who is ruling another country. So we're maybe closer to the same level, as opposed to, I'm going to talk down to these little Europeans that are, in my sphere of influence that I control, because I can throw money at them or take it away, let's say for, funding NATO or something like that, or anything else for that matter. And so you see the difference in communication, even when Vance went to Europe, and he was really harsh, in terms of what he said when he talked about European leaders. And that sort of decorum of Europeans, at least publicly perceiving themselves as being at the same level as the US, was completely broken, right? They were now shown as vassals that perhaps some would say are, right? The relationship between the US and the EU is completely unequal. It's asymmetric. And that was almost publicly embarrassing, but also true to what the relationship actually is. And so I think that idea that Trump has made many, many positive comments, at least before 2022, about Putin, has really fed into the narrative that was being disseminated that Trump is somehow controlled by Russia. Obviously, that's been debunked now. And it's really interesting. I still think that he might have that perception of Putin today, even though obviously he's made very tough comments about, his ultimatums and things like that. And so if he doesn't perceive like he's being maybe slighted by Putin, if Putin can find a way to communicate with him in a way that Trump finds complimentary, that little key to his particular personality type, let's call it that, I think it might actually be reasonably successful. But to kind of walk back from that, we've had multiple meetings that were supposed to be agreements that were supposed to be adhered to, and then that didn't happen, right? So we previously talked about Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, right? 2014, 2015. Those were about the hostilities between Kiev and the two breakaway so-called republics. Right now, by Russia, they're considered part of the Russian Federation, Donetsk and Lugansk, and the European Union essentially, or let's call it the proverbial West, to use that time to arm and train Ukraine instead of actually trying to create lasting peace in that region. And the requirements were really not that extensive. It was about having autonomy. It was about having language rights. It wasn't anything dramatic. It became dramatic in 2022 when Russia essentially reclaimed those two breakaway republics. Then we had Istanbul, right? The initial meeting that was undermined supposedly by Boris Johnson. We've had now multiple meetings between recently the Russian and the Ukrainian side where there was just almost like nothing to discuss. There was no point of even meeting other than prisoner exchanges, right? And so we've now had many of these where either they were broken, they were not adhered to, or they were pointless. So from that point of view, it's reasonable to be very skeptical about the success of this meeting. But there might be a surprise. I mean, it might be a positive surprise. So for those of us who are optimists, I think we can perceive it in this way, but I think we'll find out soon enough.
Anchorage, Alaska has a history. We just wanted you to walk us through the history. Alaska was a part of Russia. Now it's a part of America. Today, this seems like unbelievable. How did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised, I think, like everyone else, because usually for negotiations of this kind, the parties would choose more of a neutral platform instead of visiting each other. So I was definitely surprised by the fact that Putin will travel to the US, and I was also surprised by the choice of Alaska because of that shared history. In fact, Alaska is closer geographically to Russia than it is to the United States, of which it obviously is a part, and it's been a state probably shorter than most states. I think Alaska and Hawaii became states officially in the middle of the 20th century after World War II. But yeah, you are right. Alaska was briefly a part of Russia. So this was sort of part of the general age of discovery, as Europeans like to call it. And Russia was expanding continentally, right, going east, but it also started pursuing more of maritime exploration. And so Alaska wasn't the only place in North America where Russia briefly settled. So there's a place in California where I've never been, but I think it would be interesting to visit, called Fort Ross. Today it's a historic site. This was also a small settlement by Russia. It was smaller than the one on Alaska, but it still has that history. So that kind of shows you the connection to North America. So the Russians initially came across Alaska in the 1730s, right? So quite a long time ago. They ended up really settling it in 1799. And this was more of a, much like European countries, and as a caveat, I don't necessarily consider Russia a European country. To me, it's sort of this great in between, right? It's neither Europe nor Asia. It is Eurasia. I believe it is its own civilization. But of course, at this time, Russia was following a lot of these European trends. To a different extent, Russia wasn't engaging in colonization the way that Europeans were in other parts of the world. And where it did settle, it was a little bit different. This would be a topic for another episode. But anyway, this is sort of the overall the overall framework, right, for when this was going on and how it was happening. So there was more of a commercial aspect here. And so they actually established the Russian American company at this time. And you can imagine what would be interesting in Alaska. Obviously, it's a cold place in winter. It's a beautiful place, but it's not an easy place to live. There were some settlements made, so to speak, by the Russian Orthodox Church, which still exists in Alaska. I mean, there's still that history where some people still subscribe to this religion. The Orthodox Church was not nearly as aggressive, let's say, as the Catholics when they went on missions. They sort of didn't force people to convert. They kind of lived a little bit apart. Again, this would be a topic for another episode, but that history is still there. Some people still practice Orthodoxy. Now, obviously, Alaska had its own native population that's been there much, much, much longer than the Europeans that came there, the Russians that came there. Those people still live there, of course. And, we should definitely recognize their presence there before, others arrived. However, Russia was obviously a very large empire, and it was just becoming very difficult, especially when the government was a little bit more involved than the initial more commercial, expansion in Alaska, to maintain and protect that land. This is why the decision eventually in the 1860s was made to sell Alaska to the United States. And this happened under Tsar Alexander II, and everyone knows that just a few decades later, they discovered all these amazing natural resources. There was the gold rush and all this other stuff. So usually there's this joke that, Russia ended up selling it very cheaply, and then the Americans ended up getting all this benefit of Alaska's natural resources. So obviously, it's a state that's connected, physically connected, geographically connected to Canada, and it didn't become officially a state until, the middle, I believe it's 1959, much like Hawaii, that is also removed from the mainland United States. So I think when the Russians were selling it, they also sold a couple of nearby islands that sort of pertain to that land. But yeah, there is that connection there. So I think the choice of the platform, I'm not sure for Trump how deliberate this was, but obviously the media picked up on it and started, discussing it from various perspectives. So
why America? Wasn't Canada there to buy Alaska?
Well, Canada is a little bit of a different scenario. I mean, Canada, much like South Asia, was controlled by Britain. The French, as you know, the French were obviously in Quebec and other parts, let's say like in Manitoba, for instance, but Britain was generally in control of Canada. And I mean, even today, Canada is officially under the British, well, now king, no longer the queen. So that was very, very different. And of course, the relationship between Canada and the US in terms of figuring out where the borders are was not always amicable. If you remember the War of 1812, for Russians, the War of 1812 is Napoleon. For North Americans, the War of 1812 is the war between Canada and the US. But of course, Canada was really Britain and the US. So if you actually look into the history of establishing the border between the US and Canada, it wasn't always, it wasn't always peachy. So Canada is a little bit of a different scenario. Obviously, it became a state, a country later, much later than the US. It's much less populated, and I would say it's very, very different. But again, this would be a discussion for another episode, looking at the history of settlement and colonialism and colonization of North America.